Testing, 1, 2, 3. Can you hear me? Nolan is upstairs getting ready. We've been trying forever to get our schedule together so we can both sit down to do this video, but hopefully tonight we'll get it accomplished. So we actually get quite a few emails about people asking us if it's an option for them to join the Mennonites, kind of questions about how that all works, the process, where can they find a Mennonite church. It's just a very popular question that we get asked, and so we wanted to make a video in depth. We want to cover things like just a quick brief run of theology, some of the things that we differ in from a lot of mainstream Christians, just so you kind of had an understanding of the differences in that area. And then we also want to cover a little bit the ups and the downs about being part of a Mennonite community. We want to do our best to kind of give a step back and try to give an outside look from possibly your perspective, even from an insider's perspective, what we would feel are definitely some of the pros and cons, so to speak, or the ups and the downs of being a part of a Mennonite community. After that, we'll share some resources, some places where you can go to try to help find a church in your area. And then we also want to cover some cultural things that you might find interesting. I've heard different people that join that were not raised Mennonite. There's so many cultural things we have that we don't often realize, and people coming in have quite the shock. I don't know if we'll get them all covered because I don't always think about them, but we'll try to cover as much as we can. So as soon as my husband is ready and is down here, we want to dive into this together. Also, if you're new here, my name is Janine. This is my kind of mom family channel. We do anything from lifestyle to some faith videos like this one. And I usually like to grab my husband for more of the theological stuff because he's much better of a thinker than I am. So, let's do it. Now this video is obviously extremely long, but we wanted to take our time so that we could share this with people that are truly interested in that we cover all the bases, or at least try to. So if you go down in the timeline, there will be timestamps to all the different topics if you want to scroll ahead and skip some parts. So yeah, thanks for being here, and I hope you enjoy. So this is my better half, Nolan, in case you've never met him before.
The other half, I'm not sure about the better one, but I'm a little bit hesitant to know exactly how to go about a subject like this, because there's obviously people come from all different kinds of viewpoints and they have different questions. So the purpose basically of this is give you all a little bit of an idea of the Mennonite Anabaptist background, at least as far as we know it, and hopefully answer a few of your questions.
And not just the background, like the whole culture.
The culture,
the
yeah.
part of it, or the faith part of it and everything.
Right. You know, I know that if you've watched, I hate to say our videos because they're very much her videos, but you know, we live this way. We're very happy to live this way, but when Jesus calls us to follow him, and the gospel message is something that's greater than what we'll be talking about tonight. So I don't want anybody listening to this to think that, oh, you know, we are giving you know, how to be saved and how to follow Jesus. This is a little more, you know, what it means to be a Mennonite. So that's kind of where we're going with this.
Yeah. Should we swap out your chair? Oh, please. Is yours a squeaky one? There, that's better. I know that if we go through the video, it's gonna annoy me.
Just like if you were talking about this country or anything, most people would start with the history. So a little bit of Mennonite history.
Just write down his line, history.
Well, yeah. Now this history hasn't been my interest as much, maybe, as other history. And yeah, maybe it has more to do with being a little bit force-fed it back in the day, but
school mentality, you didn't want to learn it.
Yeah, anyway, the Anabaptist movement would have started 1500 sometime, and the Mennonite group was sort of an offshoot of that. There was a guy named Menno Simons,
Catholic priest
that felt that the Catholic structure wasn't, you know, had some holes or whatever. So that's where the name Mennonite comes from him. The first Anabaptist movement, I think, happened in, was it Geneva, Switzerland? Technically, that was the first time when people rebaptized. That's what Anabaptist would mean, would be rebaptizer, because they felt to be baptized as an infant was not something you chose to do, and therefore it was not really a valid baptism. I personally sometimes am a little bit uncomfortable with the fact that Mennonite goes back to a certain man and we take his namesake, but you know, some of that just tends to happen regardless. And so
yeah, so then from there they would have been persecuted. Was all part of, was it the Reformation?
Yeah, this was all happening during the Reformation, and there was obviously persecution from the Catholics, and then quite a bit of persecution from some of the Protestant groups, from Lutherans, and a guy named Zwingli, his group did not care for the Anabaptists either. And through that, as you know, during that time, the New World was discovered. A lot of Mennonites emigrated to the New World to escape persecution. So that's some of the history. Yeah, hopefully we didn't bore you too much with it, but so some of the theology. Now, obviously, like I said in the beginning, this is not necessarily how to follow Jesus, whatever. What some of the things we'd be going over is what would differentiate Mennonite Anabaptists from other Protestant groups. Some of the things we would do or not do, or etc. So probably one of the biggest things is non-resistance, non-violence. If there's a war, Mennonites generally are conscientious objectors. They, you know, would believe that going to war is wrong. But it goes more than that, like not...
Everyday life, living it out, everyday life, which is difficult.
Right. There are hard things with that, you know, and I admit I don't have that all figured out in my mind what that means, but that is a very core Mennonite belief. You know, when Jesus said, resist not evil, that's something he literally meant. That,
and,
you know,
turning the other cheek and going the extra mile, and
right.
And then there's the age-old debate of where the line is on that, like
right.
what love is. You know, if your family's getting attacked, you know, do you use force to, you know, of course some people would believe, of course you would, others would say, no, you don't. And
yeah, I think it's important to, you know, Jesus gave the two greatest commandments, and they are to love God with everything you have and to love people as you love yourself. And I think...
Go ahead.
Yeah, we can sometimes make non-resistance the end in itself rather than loving people. And loving people is a messy thing sometimes, and it's, you know, if you're helping somebody, say, who's a drug addict, there's times you're probably going to have to be forceful with them. So, you know, I think it's important to keep those ideas in perspective, that non-resistance is a beautiful teaching, I believe, but it's not an end in itself. And
I thought I turned your phone off. Who is it?
I don't know.
Oh, that's annoying.
So another thing that would be different, and this isn't all other Protestant groups, not at all, but Mennonites very much believe that salvation is, it's not just something that you've heard the quote, you pray the sinner's prayer, and while that is a part of the salvation experience, it goes beyond that, you know.
It's a continuous living.
Right, to repent. I think sometimes we have this idea that, you know, when you hear of somebody repenting, you have this image of them, you know, on their knees saying they're sorry, and that's very much part of it, but it actually means to change. So this one is a little bit more, I can't say that, oh, you know, we believe in salvation like this, and
our focus isn't so much just trying to get someone to say the sinner's prayer like some churches would be. It's just,
right, do you believe
that's kind of the focus, and then you're saved and you're pretty much good to go.
Right, and I guess another thing along with that is we would very much want to make sure someone is old enough to make that decision on their own.
Yeah.
Somebody who's very young, who wouldn't really understand moral concepts or whatever, we'd be a little hesitant to try to get them to, you know, be saved and whatever all. And I don't have all the answers as to when somebody is old enough to understand things and when they aren't. That obviously varies a lot with people.
The next one that's a big one, is separation, obviously. And there's definitely a lot of differences in churches as far as how we appear outwardly. But when Mennonites talk about separation, they often also talk about your outward appearance. And that can really vary. And so, yeah, go ahead. You have a better way of explaining things.
The idea, there's a verse in the Bible that says, "Come out from among them and be ye separate." That's the King James or whatever. Mennonites, Anabaptists take that in a very literal sense.
And some would view this pretty casually too. Like, as far as it's much more of living your life separately. Like, that's the teaching behind it.
Right.
But then some churches are so wrapped up in their culture, or culture and tradition has almost trumped Jesus' work in our life. And so separation to them has become an outward thing. Whereas I would feel like we are in our church, it's just kind of tradition mixed along with, you know, a kind of set of guidelines that obviously we do believe in modesty and unity, and in some ways that's expressed in how we dress. But I think the core teaching of that verse isn't really saying that we have to come out and dress differently to be different.
Right.
And I do think that is a fault with Mennonites.
It is. It's while I feel being different ways of, say, dressing than what everybody else does, it can be beneficial in a lot of ways. I think it can help us to make the real separation. I mean, obviously what those verses, the separation, come out from among them and be separate, is talking about something on a much deeper level than what we wear and how we, you know, what we do and don't do in a physical sense, whatever. So I think having some guidelines in place for the outside can be very helpful, but at the same time, there is no doubt that it can be very harmful too, or it can be very misused, maybe is a better way of putting it.
Just as in anything in life, you have one extreme and you have another extreme. And it's good to try to bring the two together and try to find your way in the middle.
There's another verse too that says, and this is often separation is talked about as separation or non-conformity, which is, rather big, vague word, but based on the verse that be not conformed to this world. And I think that, you know, one of the problems that we can have is that's where we stop. You know, be not conformed to the world. And the rest of the verse says, be transformed by the renewing of your mind, which says nothing about what you wear or what you drive. Or so it's very important that we keep that as our focus, to be, to allow Christ to transform us.
Another thing along with this, I think another reason that Mennonites tend to have more of a dress code sometimes is just the thing of trying to avoid all the fads and fashions that are just constantly, it's just another thing that kind of goes with this non-conformity. Not that fads and fashions are so wrong, but you can become easily consumed with them. I know for myself, I personally prefer this. It makes your life much easier and simpler to just have a simple wardrobe than constantly be worrying about what's in and what's not. And of course there are fads and fashions among the Mennonites, and it does kind of trend a little bit with what's going on in society. So, you know, we buy our sweaters and buy different things and clothes. So of course trends change, but I still say we have a fairly simple wardrobe. And what I find fascinating is I love watching like successful people and kind of what makes them tick. And so many people that are quite successful in life, actually one of their tips is that they try to reserve all their decisions, to make them to a minimum so that they can put all their energy into whatever they're trying to achieve. And so some people will have the exact same color of a t-shirt, exact same jeans, and just like 5 or 6 different pairs. So every morning they get up, they don't have to take one extra, just minute piece of energy to try to decide what to wear. And I feel like that's kind of a blessing in our culture in a sense, where it's not just this huge headache all the time, but it can be.
There still is a lot of room, you know, at least in the church we go, there's a lot of room for different clothes, and I wouldn't want somebody to feel like, I mean, there are people out there that, can get up in the morning and put the same clothes on day after day after day, and You know, to me, I'm not really a clothes guy, and yet, you know, that would look about as boring as getting up in the morning and eating the same breakfast every morning. Like,
no, I agree. I was just referring
you know,
to like our style is very, like we have a lot of different personality and different people wear different things and different styles kind of within our churches too.
Right.
It's not so like everyone looks the same or whatever. It's
Yeah.
just like with fads, like especially with like major fads, like they come and go within like a couple months.
Mm-hmm.
They say it's one of the worst things for the global, what's the word? Like there's so much trash, like the whole...
Oh, like the supply chain.
Yeah,
whatever,
they're constantly making new clothes and they just get pitched and dumped, and it's so wasteful and it's just harming the planet. And if you want to go down that route, but
Yeah.
like it's true, like people are, you buy something and 3 months later it's out of style, especially some of these styles that, but anyway, we're going off topic.
Right.
We need to keep moving.
And yeah, I mean, just one other thing too. If you're interested in Mennonites, this issue here, this separation, this is, you know, there is a lot of variation among Mennonite Anabaptist groups
And
in
we're gonna,
this whole thing.
yeah,
So.
we're going to touch more on that a little bit later too. Try to.
So another thing that's different is the Mennonite belief on divorce and remarriage. We believe that marriage is for life. The Bible does give room for, if your spouse is abusive, yeah, it says God is not the author of confusion but of peace. But we would believe that does not give you the right to disannul your marriage and go be married to somebody else. In other words, your first marriage is the one that, in God's eyes, that is who you're married to till either one of you would pass away.
Right.
It makes it kind of difficult because there's a lot of very hurting situations, very hurting people.
And even people that have been in a really terrible marriage
Mm-hmm.
and got remarried to someone and they're in a very good marriage.
Right.
And there's been situations like that where people have wanted to join, and it makes it very difficult because it's a very, yeah, it's a very staunch thing in our groups, which I love because it makes for really strong families. Now obviously it's not foolproof. There are families that are dysfunctional and aren't getting along and that type of thing, and sometimes separation is what needs to happen, but remarriage is never really an option. The last thing we have, maybe we've missed some, but I think we've gotten pretty much everything, is obviously the head covering, women head cover. This varies a lot too in different styles, depending what church you're talking about, but we're not going to talk about it here. I actually made an entire video, it's a pretty long one, describing the verses, the different viewpoints different people have on 1 Corinthians 11, so I'll have that down in the description, also up here if you want to go check it out. So we're not going to spend a lot of time on that, but obviously that is one of the main things also that separates Mennonites from a lot of other Christian groups. Another difference that I feel kind of goes along with the head covering is like the headship order. That has to do kind of with different roles for men, for women, for children, and I talk about that in the video as well. So is that it for theology?
Pretty much, yeah.
Like he said, we're just covering kind of the differences, not obviously our entire theology.
Yeah, we're kind of assuming that we're sort of answering questions from people that I assume have a Christian understanding and background, and they're interested in Mennonites, and they have questions about what would make us. Obviously, we look different than some people, and they wonder, you know, what is different about a Mennonite church versus, another Protestant church or whatever. Well, you know, if you have a chance to dive into like Mennonite Anabaptist history, there's some wonderful books out there. I can't think of any off the top of my head, but yeah.
We'll try to have some websites linked below too with different resources, I guess. I'll try to find some. All right, we're going to move on to, I have pros and cons, but that's not really a good title. Kind of the ups and the downs. Like, we want to be as transparent as we can because we've kind of seen people come in with certain expectations and maybe they were let down, and so we'd like to be upfront that obviously, I think sometimes people look at the Mennonite culture and kind of, it depends, not always obviously, but they kind of look at our culture as sort of this Christian utopia, like this, somehow this perfection that if they'd live this lifestyle, somehow they'd be closer to God. So that's one thing we definitely wanted to clear up, that we are just as human as anyone else, and in a lot of the things that anybody struggles with, we have these issues in our churches as well. So if you come and join, it's not this perfect Christian group where no one fails and no one hurts each other and no one gets because we have hurting people, we have broken people, we have people in our churches that might be hiding behind the facade of our Mennonite culture, and they're not really born again, they're not walking with Christ, so their lives are actually quite sinful, but you might not be able to really notice it just by seeing them. And it's this type of thing that causes problems within the church. And also Christians, I mean, we're all human, we all have our things we face, so if you're expecting perfection, then it's definitely not the place for you. Anything else you wanted to add?
No, I think you covered it really well. But yeah, we are really, truly, as human, sometimes I think we're even a little bit worse than some other people. There's been some incredibly ugly situations in Mennonite churches, and I suppose that's happened other places, but it's sad, but that's the truth. These
types of sins that come up, or these, whatever you want to call it, it makes it even uglier because it's in a setting that it shouldn't be happening. And just like you hear, and it's not just Mennonite churches, it's all churches. You know, you hear pastors, I think I saw on the news, that were part of a sex trafficking ring.
Yeah.
Just terrible. And all under the guise of religion, and it's so sad that these types of things happen and the name of Jesus is marred like that. And of course, that type of thing really draws out headlines, and people love to jump on that type of thing. So things like that do happen in our churches. Just wanted to make sure. I mean, not the sex trafficking, yeah. Anyway, you know what I'm getting at. Shall we just go over the negative stuff first, or shall we try to balance it out?
Yeah, we should go over the cons first and finish on a positive note.
Yeah. So just saying, like, for our personal journey, you know, my teenage life, we first got married, both of us, you know, questioning a lot of things we've been taught, questioning some of the negatives that we'll cover that are part of the church and whether or not we want to stay a part of it. So there was a point in our life where we were close to or thinking about walking out. So we chose to stay. We're very glad we did. We're kind of going to go over that, just kind of our thought process. And I know other people within the church battle with some of these things as well. So it's kind of like we wanted to talk about this in case you're thinking of joining up. That way you kind of understand a little bit more some of the things that you'll be facing that aren't so great, or aren't great at all, are kind of negatives that come with the culture, and whether or not it's something that you feel is worth it with the things that you gain. Because I think there's a lot of values here, but there's also some negatives. So you just kind of have to weigh the two and say, is the positives worth dealing with some of the baggage? If you can call it baggage.
It is,
It is baggage.
A lot of it is, I mean, a lot of the cons isn't so much things that are so different from other groups. I mean, I feel like every church would have, probably have problems similar to this. What I think, you know, we talked about people that come in, and the Mennonite track record for non-Mennonite people who join and stay is not good. Like, a lot of times within a couple years, they realize that we are as human as everyone else, and they become disillusioned and leave, and
become almost bitter in some ways.
Right, and sometimes for good reason.
Right. And I've also seen people that join, and I think it's also this expectation that somehow our outward appearance is part of our salvation when it's not. And so when they come to a group, they become extremely conservative, almost even more so within that group. And they stick around for about a year or so, and soon they're off trying to find another church that's even more conservative. And it takes about, it's almost always within like 2 years, 3 years, they keep going from one church to the next. Each one seems to be a little more conservative, as if they're trying to find whatever that was they were looking, that answer that is actually not within the Mennonites.
No.
And so that's kind of why we're making this. We're hoping you can understand that. So, and then usually they end up leaving all Mennonites, and maybe sometimes even faith, and that's really sad. So we
talked a little bit about legalism. Things can be a principle can be lost. I mean, something like we talked about clothes, so something like modesty, which I believe the Bible very much teaches the principle of modesty, but that principle can actually be lost sometimes and be replaced by actual rules about the inches of how long a dress should be, or, you know,
how loose your pants should be, or
yeah, things that, and I'm not saying that as soon as you put a number to a rule or whatever, then immediately you're legalistic or whatever, but it has bothered me how it seems like, you know, sometimes somebody can, I like what that one lady said about modesty, that it, you know, it's 90% your heart and 10% your clothes, and how somebody can be very immature, and you could say very kind of maybe immodest in the way they interact with people. But if they have the right clothes on, then nobody will really say, hey, look, do you think, you know, the way you're acting or living is really good? You know, the flip side of that is somebody can be very mature and modest in their interactions with people, and yet maybe there's, you know, they have the wrong color of shoes or something, and you know, yeah, if you get my drift, it can be that way.
And one thing I'll quick interject, you have to understand the Mennonite spectrum is absolutely huge.
It is.
Like, you have extremely conservative Mennonites that drive horse and buggy. They wear bonnets. They ride bikes. They don't have cars. That type of thing. Very, I'd say on that spectrum you tend to have more legalism. And then you have the other spectrum that isn't nearly as much so. And when we're talking about Mennonites, by the way, we didn't clarify this. We're talking about conservative Mennonite groups. There are Mennonite churches within the U.S. that look nothing like us. They just dress like society. So the Mennonites we're talking about are Mennonite groups, or conservative Mennonite groups that dress usually with dresses or skirt and blouse, and wear a head covering as far as the women. Yeah, and then on the other spectrum, you often have people that, they buy more of their clothes, like usually they wear skirts, skirts and blouse, but they wouldn't have nearly all the technicalities. So when we're talking about these cons, they often tend to lean towards this side of the spectrum, towards the really conservative, middle conservative groups. And it all depends on the church you go to.
That's not to say that being legalistic is only a problem. I mean, I would guess that some of you all could relate to legalism in non-Mennonite churches. It's a human problem, and I don't think that just because we aren't super conservative that we can say, well, we don't have quite as much of a problem with it as, I mean, it can be.
A lot of people would still look at us as pretty conservative, though.
Well, yeah. I guess.
Within the Mennonite spectrum, we're not as much so, but we still are. And
this whole legalism thing is probably what has caused the most bitterness and hurt to people.
And it's probably the one we're staying on the longest of all of these. I will say that I think this is the biggest con of the Mennonite structure. Is it opens the door maybe a little wider to legalism than some other Protestant groups would. And the problem with it, I mean, it is a really hard line to walk, because we do have a culture that they're trying to keep. And so there has to be some kind of structure there, because if there's no, like for instance, for our church, it's the women wear dresses that we make ourselves, more of a cape style. There's like an extra piece of cloth on top for modesty. And that's just kind of part of the guidelines. So I would not go to church wearing a skirt and a blouse. And it's just kind of part of, I just know that. I don't wear that normally in public and that type of thing. So it is one of those things, if someone were to do that, it should be addressed by someone. You know, obviously we can't just go, everyone do what they want, or suddenly we're no longer part of our culture. And so it's what makes us who we are and how we live out our lives. So there has to be some kind of like because there's always someone that wants to do something different, and they have to ultimately decide, well, do they want to be a part of this group and support it or leave? And so there is support that you need to give to your church and agree with whatever guidelines are in place, with wherever you chose to go. But we're just saying that there has been times where, and we're talking about technicalities that would probably blow a lot of non-Mennonites away.
Right.
I'm like talking, I don't know, shall we dive into things here? I mean, if people are trying to...
Yeah, I mean, if, you know, people sometimes come into the Mennonite Church and they're like, wow, this is, you have all these people that, you know, they just, yeah.
They look so unified or something.
They look so unified, they look so, not all this variation, and yeah, and then they realize that in order for that to happen, people have, you know, people have been dealt with, as far as, maybe that's
talk
to, whatever, for something as simple as, you know, socks not quite being the right color or something like that, you know, and that
shoes.
There again, that depends a lot on the Mennonite church or group or whatever. You know, that is, the more conservative groups would have more rules.
You would have rules on what types of shoes you can wear, socks you can wear. Some places, yeah, it can get very technical and it can kind of get ugly.
It's something to keep in mind if you see a group of everybody looks the same. Maybe they're all, you know, dressed in dark colors or whatever. That the ugly side of that is there was people who had a slightly lighter shade maybe, and they were told that they need to put a darker shade back on, and maybe it was an honest mistake on their part, and you know, hopefully they were able to, you know, not become bitter about it. But far too many people have been really hurt, you know, accused, maybe even falsely, of doing something that they weren't. And that is very much the, I guess you could say, the ugly side of having a distinctly, almost a dress code sometimes that at least sometimes we would have, or some churches among us would have more so than others.
And there's also a difference in leadership as well. Just as with anyone, some people are gifted in relationships and others not so much. And so whoever's job it is to make sure that the guidelines are kept, if they're very bad with interpersonal relationships, it's often these types of people that cause all the, you know, the bitterness and the, you know, I've been in settings where, you know, the leadership was very understanding, very caring. Maybe they would listen to you, understand where you're coming from. But they still had to follow through because they were part, like a lot of these churches might be part of a really large conference or like a large group, not all. And so even sometimes the leadership might not actually be in full agreement with what they're doing, but because they're part of a bigger thing, they don't really have the personal, like they have to do kind of what the structure says to do. And so there may be a lot of people that would agree with you, but that was the other con that we had here, is it's very hard for something to change within these large structures. So even if a lot of the people within that group, I guess it's the same as a country, you know, there's laws in place, and to change a law, it has so many politics to go through. And it's very similar. And so if there's been a tradition that's been going for 50 years, some of the older people might not want to see it go, and a lot of the younger ones are saying, look, this does not apply to our era. It usually takes years and years and years of work and talk and whatever to get that changed, and that can be very frustrating.
And I will say too, with this legalistic thing, it's easy sometimes to pin the blame on, if I say have a shirt on that's not within a church's rules, say, and so somebody would, you know, say a church pastor would come talk to me about it, you know, it may be kind of a very impersonal way or whatever, and it would make me angry, and it's easy to pin legalism on him. But if I'm letting a shirt stand between me and a relationship and loving, you know, the people I go to church with, then I'm as guilty of being legalistic as he might be for making a huge issue over it. So
right.
it's something, it cuts both ways, and I think sometimes Mennonite youth forget that you know they can be as legalistic as the people that are maybe being legalistic to them. So
that's our biggest one we're going to talk about, and it's not one that's fun to talk about, but it's definitely, if you're going to join up on it with a church, it's something you need to be aware of, because if the church you're a part of has nothing of this, it's going to be like a major shockwave when you join. And by join, we mean become members. Like, churches everywhere will welcome anyone in their doors to come, sit in church and worship. It's just when you want to become a part of the group, become a member, that's what we call it, a member of the church. Anyway, so it definitely can be a real shock if suddenly someone is saying, depending which church you end up going to, and that's the big thing, if suddenly you're used to wearing sandals everywhere you go and that particular church wants you to wear shoes and socks. It's little things like that that can quickly become a thorn in the side if you weren't aware of it before. So we will talk later about churches we recommend. I'll have it in a blog. We might not necessarily say it on here, but there's hundreds of thousands of churches, especially in the United States, that you could join, and they vary so much. So if your first experience visiting a church isn't the best or isn't what you were expecting, just remember that they vary about as much as,
We talked about legalism being the biggest problem, and it is, because, I mean, it is in some ways, and yet
it's probably the most rampant, or the most in your face, most common.
There have been churches that have had, and I suppose this is true for other churches, other non-Mennonite churches, there's been some serious problems with, I mean, there's been abuse, there's been sex abuse, there's been different abuses that have happened in the Mennonite church.
Not that they knew that it was ongoing, but that they found out about.
Right, and I would assume that everyone would realize that these kinds of things, no human group out there is, you can't go anywhere and say, all right, well, now this will never ever happen here. People are people. But it's still, I don't want anyone to think that Mennonite churches are free of this kind of thing.
At this point, wasn't that this really happens a lot. We hope it doesn't.
No.
But the point is that sometimes churches, and I think this happens, is kind of a thing with churches, not just Mennonites, is where they try to take care of that person within their group. And maybe Christians have, as a whole, tend to believe that because you're supposed to forgive that person, it automatically means trusting them again. And those two things should not be, I think, together. I mean, you can give them some level of trust, but if a person was abusing a child, they should be reported to the state and dealt with on a state level as well, because they need to be, we need to protect our children, obviously. And so there have been possibly some incidences where maybe it's child abuse or some other type of abuse, where the perpetrator was, dealt with, maybe counseled within the church, and they thought he was ready to go or be forgiven, and then they just kind of let him go again, and then it happens again, and it's not protecting.
Right. I mean, in the church we go to takes a very hard stance on, any of that kind of stuff would be reported to the law. And a lot of Mennonite churches that I would know would be the same way. They would very much not try to cover things up. But it has happened. The whole cover-up thing, that is something that I think in the past was done more in not just Mennonite churches, but across the board. People didn't even know how to deal with some of the abuses, and it was just easier to ignore them and pretend they never happened.
Right.
And that kind of thing has happened in the Mennonite church too.
Right.
And I feel like there's much more of an awareness now among Mennonite groups. I feel like things are,
I think they're headed in the right direction.
Right. That there's an improvement. But yeah, I would just would just hold that as, once again, we are as human as anyone else. So
and these things that happen,
some of these ugly things about being human, they're a part of us too. So
any other cons you can think of?
This is kind of a pro and a con, but we talked about this different times, but there is a huge difference. People that you meet that say they're Mennonite, I mean, there is a vast difference in their lifestyles.
Yeah, it can be very culturally different between groups as well. Just speaking culturally. One thing though, I would say the majority of Mennonite groups are very similar in theology, at least the conservative groups. And by conservative I mean like head covering, dress wearing. Yeah, the differences would be more, the more conservative ones would say they might even restrict you to a certain color of car to drive. Yeah. Certain your clothes are very much spelled out what you can and cannot wear, whereas the more non-conservative people would be more general. Yeah, but you're right. The theology between the two groups would be similar, and not to be negative, but another con is that there has been a fair amount of disagreement. I hate to use the term infighting, but it almost does apply among Mennonite groups and churches. Some have a vision this way, some have a vision this way.
Right, and that's probably, I don't know if you look in the Bible, Paul and Barnabas had a disagreement about whether or not to take John Mark with them, and so some of that is human, and I don't think that just because two groups of Christian people disagree on something that automatically means that they're both in the wrong and whatever all. People are people, and God calls people to different walks of life, but I have seen so much in the Mennonite Church that I cannot say is of God. It's been the work of the devil to drive people apart, and maybe that ties in with legalism.
It's just the fact that we're all human. I don't think you'll get away from that no matter where you go. Yeah. But there's definitely groups we've been a part of that are very unified, and groups not so much. So, and we've been to, we've traveled a fair amount and gone to different Bible schools and different churches and taught in different places and gotten to see a fair amount. So, is that it?
Yeah, I think.
Now I'll move on to the little happier side.
You probably are wondering at this point, why are you guys Mennonites?
Right, exactly. So we're going to move. This was obviously, I would say what we covered is the biggest reason a lot of people leave, right?
I would say so.
Or that there's bitterness and hurt and things caused is what we covered. So it's not that we're trying to be negative, but it's good if because I just can't believe how many people email us and want to join, or are very curious about our culture and want to know our churches close to them. So it's the whole point of this video, not to try to convince you to become like us or to join us, but to help those that actually do want to decide if it's for them. And then, and that's why this video is going to be forever long too, because we want to try to cover everything. So the pros, and for me personally, the upside of the Mennonite group, is why we chose to stay. And we also I believe we see a revival happening among the young. There's a real movement among the Mennonites, especially I would say a lot of the Mennonite groups actually, where I'd say there's maybe an awakening, a revival, especially among middle-aged young folks, where a lot of the stuff that we addressed, they're wanting to improve on it, to still keep the traditions that matter, but throw out the baggage, so to speak. And so I think us seeing that and seeing the heart of that, we wanted to choose to stay and be a part of that movement and see if we can help improve some of these negative things. Plus all the benefits that do come with our culture, and we're going to talk about that. So
being a Mennonite is obviously more of a simple life. There again, it depends. The more conservative groups, obviously the ones that say would drive a horse and buggy, would live a much simpler life. There's a lot of variation among those groups too, but when your horse is your means of transportation, it limits
you to a very small area.
Right, and that kind of ties into the next point, which is strong community. Being a Mennonite is very much about
community,
family. Not just you go to church and sit on a bench Sunday morning. Like, maybe this is another difference that we didn't talk about. But in a lot of Mennonite churches, everybody would take a part in teaching. You take a part cleaning the church, whatever all. And there's something to me that's kind of awesome about that. Like, rather than having, somebody that does this job for life and that job, like, where if everybody pitches in and helps, we have church work days, we have
cleaning days where we all go clean the church twice a year.
Right. We have, right now we are on as like youth sponsors to kind of help the youth with activities and whatever. And
that was for 2 years. We go off this year.
So
that's been fun. We've really enjoyed that.
Yeah.
You get to know the youth better, and yeah, it's just, there's so many different jobs, and everyone, not for pastors, obviously. And then there's often, like, we have family nights. We have events where the picnics and stuff where the church gets together. And yeah, that's, to me, is a strong plus, is the huge community. If someone is sick, the women are very quick to, there's someone in charge in the women's side to like be in charge of setting up meal schedules. So if someone is really sick, the ladies volunteer. We take meals to people. If someone had a baby, they get meals for like 2 to 3 weeks every other day or something like that, so that they can just rest and recuperate. If there's a big medical need, people pitch in offerings, and depending what church group you're a part of, if it's a huge group, like a, what do you call it, a conference, where churches nationwide will pitch in to help with a certain need.
Right.
So there's like a huge support system, and that's really comforting to be a part of. You feel needed and wanted, and
yeah, I would say with this, I mean, I know we aren't unique in having a church that's more than just a place to go worship Sunday morning.
Right. There's people have a lot. Yeah.
But that is something that I would say is across the board in the Mennonite structure. That is usually a pro. Usually there's a strong sense of community among Mennonite people.
And thinking of that, often like mega churches would be more you just go to church. And I just thought of it now. Often within Mennonite churches, if a church starts getting too large, they will start what they call an outreach, where they start another church either in another state or a few hours away where there's not a church. And then people either volunteer or they all agree that they're going to either, do they vote sometimes?
It depends.
It kind of depends on the group.
Yeah.
But if you're willing, you can be possibly chosen to go be a part of that new church. And so it kind of helps keep churches somewhat smaller. Some churches are still quite large, like 200-300 people, but we're partial to smaller churches. Under 100 is nice.
Yeah.
But
well, another one of the pros, in my opinion, is the Bible is viewed as, as something that we don't get to pick and choose what's going to be crucial or critical. Obviously, there's things in the Bible that are, the New Testament has a message that's maybe more special than the Old, and yet I don't feel like we can understand the New very well without the Old.
Right. We try not to twist scripture so that we can be accepted by society. And as society changes, I mean, you just look over the past 100 years, and so many things have changed, and I feel like we've held on to some of those values and haven't changed with society in that. Like believing marriage is between a husband and a wife, sex before marriage is out. And that is something that we strongly believe, and I think that has kind of been lost in some Christian circles. Not necessarily, I mean, I've read a lot of purity books, definitely not nearly all, but there's definitely some groups that's just kind of, as long as you're faithful to that person, it's kind of okay. Right. So within our groups, we're very, very, it happens obviously, sex before marriage, but if it's known about, it's not, I guess you can't really be a part of a Mennonite group and do something and live together or
right. I mean, that's not to say that if it happens, say that
we shun them or
yeah,
something.
they would be ostracized or whatever. But yeah, we wouldn't be able to be a member of a Mennonite church and live with your boyfriend, girlfriend.
And so people can look at us and say, oh, well, you just nitpick on this or that. But it's like we do the whole picture. You know, it's abstain from sex before marriage. Marriage is for life. Marriage is between a husband and a wife. We try not to let society dictate on what we know the Bible to say. So the next point right along with that is is probably one of the largest factors right along with strong community for me, is that marriage for life is to be divorced is really not an option. And we grow up with this mentality, and to separate isn't even something that really comes to our minds. It's ingrained in us. So marriage is taken very seriously. We don't jump into it without much prayer. And if you've all seen the struggle I went through with one of my other videos that we shared our love story. It wasn't easy, but I still can't believe I landed him sometimes, but I got him. When people separate, it just tears families apart, and you see what it does to children. There's just so much pain that comes from separation and divorce and that type of thing, and that affects children for life. You know, I have pretty much any time you go into any type of counseling or psychological things that people talk about, they often reference to a point in their childhood when their parents broke up. Like it's just something that just affects a child so deeply. And I know that bad marriages obviously affect a child too, and we're not immune to that. There's people that Christ is not the center, or they're really struggling to get along, and sometimes you think it would be best if they just separated, even for the children's sake.
It's very shattering to a child to have to suddenly make sense of their parents not living together, and they live with the one and then go live with the other. And you know, if that was your life story growing up, we do not mean to shame you at all for that.
Right.
It just...
And it is kind of hard to talk about some of this, because I do know there's a lot of viewers on here that have went through that, or maybe they're the parents of children, and maybe you deal with guilt, and we're not trying at all to shame or make you feel guilty or less of a parent, or like what should I be saying?
No, I think so too. It's, you know, we're explaining what we think is the pros of the Mennonite structure. I feel like the Bible does give us direction on marriage and how we are to live our lives. You know, my growing up years, I mean, my friends, their parents were just all together, you know, and I didn't realize then. It was only when I was older that I realized how, you know, in the grand scope of things, to a lot of people growing up, that is just not the way it is for them. You know, a lot of their friends, I mean, if more than 50% of marriages end in divorce, then that means that, you know, your normal public schools, I mean, over 50% of the kids are in that kind of situation. And I can't imagine the dynamic of that, you know, growing up.
It's so foreign to us. And that's a huge blessing that I feel from living in this culture, in the Mennonite Anabaptist Faith or whatever. And along with that is children have the security of parents staying together. I feel like this is huge because, like he said, all their friends as parents are together for the most part, not always. You have all these families where they believe marriage is a commitment. No matter what bad things come your way, no matter what happens, you're committed. And that foundation of commitment, anyway, makes for a strong community even outside your family and in your church. And that, to me, that is what marriage is. It's vows. It's not only if we still love each other.
Right.
And so, I mean, there's often been times that we've struggled, but it's not an option to separate, and we work through things, and then you come through it stronger.
She throws a dish at me.
Take that back.
No, she's never thrown dishes that way.
And even in a marriage, like, I'm never worried about when I'm in a really bad mood or really struggling personally with things I'm going through in my life, where I'm just not being so kind to him when I should be. and just really working through things, I don't have to worry in the back of my mind that, oh, he's going to leave me now for someone else. It happens, but I trust, because of just how we've been raised, that won't happen. And I just fully trust him that he stays with me. And that foundation of trust within a marriage, I think, helps it blossom and grow much more than if it was always something I was worried about him leaving because of my performance.
Well, and I want to say too that we talked a little about a bit about there are bad marriages in the Mennonite Church, and sometimes they're bad marriages and because the culture doesn't really allow anyone, you know, obviously divorce is frowned on. So I guess what I just want to say is I think that marriage is, if she's afraid, or if she's not afraid that I'll leave her, or vice versa, simply because we live in a culture that's not done, and that's the extent of things. Maybe I'm being confusing. I guess I mean, a real godly Christian marriage has to go so much deeper than simply going to a church and being part of a group that, like the Mennonites, where marriage is a commitment for life, and that's what is done. Like, you know, so I just, you know, I want to say that is a pro of the Mennonite Church, because, you know, that is the vast majority of Mennonite marriages stay together for life.
But it doesn't make them immune to bad marriages. Right. Yeah, I'm not trying to. It's just one of the main pros, I think, about our culture, because it's so rare in society today.
So another point would be, we have, and there's some homeschooling that some Mennonites would do.
Actually, a fair amount.
Yeah. But there's a lot of our own private schools too. We would very few Mennonites. There would be some that would use the public school system, but they'd be a rarity. Most Mennonites would either homeschool or send them to like a private school that's like a church-ran school or whatever.
Yeah.
And that's what I went to school in. That's what she went to school in. And maybe I'd be a much smarter person if I had went to like a public school system. But not to be pessimistic, but what I see the public school system cranking out sometimes, I don't feel like I missed out on that much.
And what's nice is our schools are much smaller too, and so teachers have a lot more interaction with each personal student, and if there's a struggling student, they can kind of help them through a little easier. The other nice thing is, you know, that you're sending them to a school with the same values that you have. So you're not worried about things being taught to them that you do not agree with at all, like we see going on with a lot of parents today. Sending their kids to public school and all the things that are going on. Another big one, at least for me especially, that I love is, it goes along with community, and that is the global connection you have. So if you're traveling or somewhere and you happen to meet another Mennonite, I mean, we can pick each other out, like, obviously. There's an immediate connection even if you don't know them. So often, especially if you're in an area where there's not lots of Mennonites, if you're out somewhere in an area where there's like just one church or something and suddenly you're the newcomer, it's very prone that you'll talk and you'll immediately have a connection like your family, even though you're complete strangers. And that I really like. And that's within many churches. I mean, it doesn't really matter if you're conservative or not. I mean, some churches maybe not so much, but there's definitely a real connection there.
There's also, like, right along with that, there's a lot of opportunities for young people, and even for middle-aged, older people, whatever, to, you know, to go to other countries and serve. The Mennonites have a fairly broad mission spectrum. A lot of Mennonite missions and things like that in other countries.
I know other churches do as well. There's obviously lots of missions in other churches. It's more because we're kind of this big global family, so to speak, if you want to call it that. I mean, obviously there's discord and things that happen that people aren't getting along like they should. But for the most part, you have all these different groups all over, and young people get to connect with other Christian, Mennonite, Anabaptist young people. Through Bible schools, there's just a plethora of Bible schools where young people go for 3 weeks, 6 weeks, and just study things overseas, missions, and it's a great opportunity for them. I went to quite a few when I was young. I loved it.
Yeah,
and then you just have a broad scope of friends, and you kind of keep up friendships. And it's just, yeah. And I think that's another thing that I've noticed with, I have non-Mennonite friends, and I've noticed that among the Mennonite groups, young people tend to have a lot of connections and a lot of friends all over the States, and they travel a lot. Like they fly all over, meeting people. That's definitely really changed in the past.
Well, and once again, there's obviously some Mennonite young people that are more than happy just to stay at home, or if some of the more conservative Mennonite churches, there'd be a lot less of traveling overseas and whatever. But yeah, I think it's wonderful that young people have an opportunity to go serve in another country, even for a couple weeks or whatever. It's pretty beneficial.
Another thing, when we had spoken before about we don't believe in going to war and that type of thing. So there's actually a lot of programs set up within the Mennonite churches where young people go serve their country in other ways. You can go work in hospitals. There's a lot of relief work, like after these hurricanes and floods. And doesn't that kind of get recorded?
Well, there's they call it a CAS program. It's basically, it's set up so that if there would be another draft, then conscientious objectors would have work projects set up
where they could
go and serve in a non-combat way or whatever.
Right.
Yeah, and then I would say another pro is Mennonites are generally very hardworking. Yeah, that doesn't mean that non-Mennonites aren't.
There's some lazy ones like me. No, I wouldn't say this is lazy.
Mennonites, and maybe it goes back to our German roots or whatever, I'm not sure, but hard work ethics, almost to a fault sometimes. I mean, it can be a con where...
And frugal.
There's workaholic Mennonites who don't have the kind of time they should have for their family or their church or people, and it's all about work.
That could be another little bit of a fault, because you'll see a lot of Mennonites tend to be business people. Like you'll see a lot of Mennonite businessmen, and it's a good thing, but I think because of hard work ethics, they're taught to save, not spend money. And the other thing is we tend to not, and that's changing some, but we don't tend to just spend our money on tons of amusement things and parties, and we don't go drinking and all the types of things where money tends to be blown at. And so money is saved more in that way. So you tend to have some people that are quite wealthy if their heart's not maybe quite where it should be, and maybe it's a little more earthly minded than it should be. That's another kind of downside sometimes in Mennonites, is they're so work oriented that they can almost become materialistic if they're not careful.
Well,
but I do love the hard work ethics, because you can just often when you hire someone among our community, you can just count on them to be a good worker. For the most part, not always. Obviously. Not
always, no. But, I mean, and being hardworking is, I know I heard one pastor say he thinks God can use a lazy person, but he's not quite sure how. And it's probably better to be, I guess I would consider having hard work ethics as being more of a pro than a con.
That's pretty much everything we have. There's obviously things I'm sure we've missed. So, next up would be, a lot of people ask how to find a church. I'm going to recommend some websites. I'm going to have them on my blog. So go down to the blog post in the description, and then I'll have links to those websites. And then underneath that, so the one website is a moderately conservative church website, but it's very good. Lots of good materials on it. You can listen to sermons, to music. And then they have a little section called Church Finder, and it's all over the world, where they have churches from pretty conservative to not quite your not so conservative spectrum. Some of them they don't have on there. So underneath that website, I think we'll maybe have some recommendations of church groups that we might recommend to look at, because you don't want to just go on that map and just think that every church might fit your need. We'll have a few linked, and we'll have writing around it to kind of recommend which ones. And then some of you have been contacting us from around the world and other countries. There's definitely outreaches, and we have churches in various countries, but is it DNI would be a good one? There's Destinations International. We'll have links to them as well. It's a group that sends out a few families. Like our church has a family in New York City, or if you're in an area and you would like to see an Anabaptist Mennonite Church, you could request that, and if there's people willing to come, different churches will sponsor a few families to come to your area. So that's another good one to reach out to. We'll have that one there. And last of all, we wanted to talk about a few cultural shocks or changes or things you might expect, especially like say when visiting a church. Often you'll find non-instrumental music,
right?
A cappella singing, 4-part harmony, kind of an old traditional. Not all, but a lot.
A lot of times too, and this isn't all Mennonite churches, but a lot of Mennonite churches do segregated seating. The men sit on one side, the ladies sit on the other.
I'm not sure.
Yeah, that's not across the board.
Yeah.
There's some family seating in some churches, but
and if you go to one of those churches and you want to sit as a family, feel free. I know most churches won't judge you for it. Another thing is most churches will kneel to pray. That's a big culture shock for some. If you call it a culture shock, they're used to standing. At our church we stand because our benches are so tight together, but a lot will actually kneel down. And if you can't, a lot of people won't. Like if you have health issues, or if you don't want to, you can just stay sitting. It doesn't matter, but it's just kind of something. If they say, okay, let's pray, and suddenly there's just this wave of people kneeling down, and if you're not used to it, you're suddenly like a deer in the headlights. So we kind of like to let you know ahead of time that if they say let's pray, sometimes they don't actually say let's kneel to pray. And many churches will actually turn around. Some churches will kneel forward, but many actually turn around and kneel backwards.
I think it was sort of like, I guess the way in some Catholic churches they kneel forward towards a saint, a statue of a saint or whatever.
Right.
This was sort of, yeah, that's what I heard. But there again, my Mennonite history isn't very good. So.
Any other things you can think of that they could expect from visiting? And you're welcome to pop into any church at any time. Just letting you know. Maybe how long the services are. They're usually about 2 hours on average. The majority of people, they have sort of an introduction, a song, a devotions in the first 15 minutes, 20 minutes, and then there's Sunday school for a half hour or so, and then there's usually a sermon message for an hour, something like that. So it can get a little long for some people, but I don't really have anything written down. There's obviously quite a few cultural things you'll encounter that we hardly even think about just in our lifestyle. What was it that Christy had said about cleaning our plates? One of our friends that joined, anyway, she said one of her culture shocks was that it's polite to leave a little bit on your plate to show the host or the hostess that you had enough. And in the Mennonite culture, you clean your plate because you don't waste any food, and that's a sign that, you know, you're hungry and the food was good, and you do not leave. It's like a slam against the cook to leave food. So to her, that was a big culture shock. So there's different, like, little mannerisms and stuff.
Some
that
of that
just really
is a
varies.
little more old school. Like, I don't know.
Yeah. So there's lots of little things like that you might run into, but that's all. Whew, this is going to be a long one, huh?
Wow.
Tired.
Yeah, I'm getting really tired.
Anyway, I hope this was helpful. If we left anything out, my fellow Mennonites, you're welcome to comment below to help. So yeah, feel free to go check out my blog. Links below. If we miss anything, I'll have it in there, but I'll just mostly have like where to find church, the websites, maybe some other things that you can go check out, and recommendations for us. It's one of those things, if you are looking for a church, you might not find the right fit for you on the first try.
In fact, if you go somewhere and you feel like it is just, after one visit, it is the place for you,
you'll probably find out that it's...
May I warn you that people there are as human as anywhere else. And I want to, you know, if that's where you feel God's calling you to, yeah, I feel like sometimes we're too negative about the Mennonites, and yeah, I think it's a wonderful culture, and I think we have, yeah, I'm not saying this in an arrogant way, I think we do have something to offer, you know, America and the world and stuff.
Especially as rapidly as times have been changing and stuff. It seems to be lately, especially after 2020 and everything that's been happening since, that we've noticed more and more emails where people are just craving like simple values, community. And if that's really what you're craving, then it might be the place for you, because I think that's the core of who we are. If you can put up with some of this other negatives that we talked about and just say, you know what, I'm willing to accept that and try to be a part of the movement that hopefully gets some of the worst things out and keeps improving as time goes on. But as far as the right church, when you're searching, obviously, like we said, there's such a huge spectrum. So the Mennonite churches that might be near to you might not be what you're looking for. So just keep that in mind. Okay? Whew. That was long. We'll see ya. Thanks for watching. Bye. You know what? I bet I could hang this off the light. We're doing redneck setup.
You look beautiful.
Thank you.
I thought that was a very, very good song.
It was pretty good. You want to sit down? Sit down.
Is that a mic?
Yeah.
Hello. Testing 1, 2, 3. I don't want me to do that. Begin.
If I could like that.
Right there.
Here, can you tape it this way? Babe, listen, it has to be pointed. It's a directional mic. You can't just point it any which Harry. Ugh. There we go. Just say something.
Hello, this is Nolan and Janine. We are talking about ministers.